What's up, everybody? I am here with Melissa Monte from the Mind Love podcast. So you can check her out at mindlove.com. Definitely go there. Her podcast is really awesome. And I love it because her style is very much like mine. Just very conversational, very off the cuff, very real, raw, and organic. And we just, we're recording this on Zoom, but we went from Skype to Squadcast, now to Zoom. So we've kind of taken the whole video conferencing or podcast recording tour. So we're going to end it here on Zoom. Melissa, how are you?
Isn't it so fitting it's like island hopping, but in this age of quarantine where it's just like, let's hang out over here now, see what it feels like.
It is. It's all the different platforms, and we had to go from one to the other because technology is so fantastic. But it was fun. I mean, it was fun. I mean, we did about an hour conversation on your podcast. Then we did two 10-minute segments on 10-Minute Mindset on mine. And now we're here having this casual conversation. Like, what's your take, your vibe, your feeling after recording together?
It's interesting because I feel like each platform unlocked a whole new type of conversation for us. And so, like I said, it's like bar hopping or something where it's like, well, how do we feel at this wine bar? So now I'm just getting a feel for this new spot. But yeah, I just love podcasters because they're the type of people who want to learn and want to share. And so excited to see what conversations come out.
Yeah, and it's always nice to, when you're doing it, I can always tell when someone's an experienced podcaster that I'm having a conversation with because I don't feel like I have to, and I always take on my show the responsibility of I'm going to carry the conversation or guide it or make the other person feel comfortable to where they can just share. But I feel like when there's another podcaster, and tell me your experience if you would, I feel like there's less of that because both people are kind of equally holding up the show.
Oh yeah, it's true. It's actually really funny because I went to PodFest. I was speaking there recently, and right before everything went down, where I wasn't allowed to travel anymore, and the first three conversations I had were with podcasters, and I realized I didn't get any words in at all. And so it's this funny balance where I'm like, oh yeah, I'm at a podcasting conversation. That person spoke for an exact 8 minutes with no breathing room, just like skirting away. So yeah, it's definitely people who like to talk.
You do solo episodes on your show too, right?
No, I always do interviews.
Oh, you've never done a solo episode?
I've done one solo episode, and it's my first one, just to share my story.
Yeah, I landed on somewhere you did some. I listened to a few of your episodes, and it seemed like at the beginning you had a little monologue.
I always have a monologue.
Yeah. So, okay. That's what I was hinting at. But so I wanted to ask, what I noticed a lot of podcasters is they start with interviews and they typically do a lot of interviews and some get really good at it and some just have a format that they stick to and follow. But I think that monologue is something that it's a huge skill to be able to hone and be able to have a conversation with someone who's not present.
Well, I create based on how I like to consume. So and I think that's a lot of the things that people do. You a niche that you create what you feel a need for. And there's a few things that I want to know in the beginning of a podcast, because there's been so many times where I've started listening to an episode and I realized 20 minutes in that I'm not interested in this guest or this topic or even this show. And so in the very beginning of all my episodes, I want people to hear a clip of the best content, and I want them to hear a personal story to get them drawn in. I want them to hear what they'll learn. And so I have a structure, even though it is a monologue. And that's something that I've ended up cultivating just to, first of all, make me a better speaker. Everything's tied into the goals of who do I want to become at the end of this. And so it's this playground that I consider it, where I can hone my craft while giving the most value.
Do you know who your exact ideal listener is? Like, do you have them named and described and to the T? Do you have a vision for that?
Yes and no. The person for me is my younger self. And so it doesn't mean that my audience is all younger than me. It's just what I knew at that time. And so, I think that's the way I keep my own attention the most, is because now my younger self might have been me a year ago. When I was starting, my younger self might have been me in my 20s. And so it allows me to continuously evolve while having my audience evolve with me.
One thing we didn't talk about on either of the podcasts that we did today is that you have an extensive background in marketing. And so I want to ask you, from doing your podcast and it being wildly successful, what's the one thing that you did marketing wise that you think made the biggest difference in your podcast?
There's a number of different things. I create, a lot of people are like, well, don't look at the algorithms or don't look at this. But I find that if you pay attention to the algorithms of the platform that you're creating for, it can give you a lot of great insight into how to create really good content. So the difference is looking at the algorithms, whether you're attached or unattached to the results. And instead of being emotionally attached, like, oh my gosh, I'm failing this, or I need to create this type of content, it's basically like being a professional creative. A mentor once told me that, because I remember I was designing an app for somebody and I just did not get his direction. And my mentor was like, well, okay, professional creativity is allowing your expression to flow within a set of guidelines. So I use the algorithms as my set of guidelines. It can teach you how to create content that people come back to, how to create content that makes people take action. And so I just have those things in mind and keep them in mind while I express myself. And that ends up being it's what helped me hone that intro of what do I include in here that are so that people feel like they're not having their time wasted, or that people feel drawn in. And so it not only helps my show to be better, but it helps me to be a better communicator as well.
What's the one thing that since you started the podcast that you've changed completely, that you didn't see coming, that you were like, okay, because like my show has changed dramatically. When I first started my show, it was just a solo show. Now it's interviews every single day. And it's different. It's a different format. It's just a different voice, and it feels better. It's evolved. And so it hasn't really changed. It's evolved. How has your show evolved? Has it evolved in any way that surprised you?
When I started, I thought it was all going to be under 30 minutes. Now it's all closer to an hour. That was based on just what I liked to do, because I would find myself ending conversations and be like, I want to know more. And so in the beginning, I would actually cut out a good 30 minutes because I just wanted to bond with the person more. And I'm like, why don't I just adapt my show style? Who says it needs to be this time? So that was one of them. Another one is I wanted to find a way to stand out. When I first created my podcast, I wanted a reason for people to feature me, even though I had no audience, no name recognition, nobody knew who I was. And so in my first 20 episodes, I added sound effects every time somebody was telling a story. That way I could go to different podcast platforms or different websites that had lists of the best podcasts and say, hey, you've never heard a mindfulness show like this one before. But it was also not sustainable to keep going because it took too much time. So it was more of a strategy, a temporary strategy. I also used to over edit, and I think that came from my own fears of not being good enough or showing imperfections. Whereas I think a lot of what's happened through developing my voice is not only I figured out what my message was, but I've become more comfortable in expressing myself. I've trusted my own ability more, and I've stopped underestimating that my audience wouldn't like me because I say a few times.
Yeah, at the beginning I was the same way. I cut out all the ums and uhs, the breaths, all of those things, and then I listened to it and I'm like, it sounds really clean, but it sounds like I never breathe. It's like, that's not real. So
Yeah.
we made some adjustments as well. But, I can't tell people enough how awesome your podcast is, and tell them to go to I want them to go to mindlove.com and check it out. You do a great job. You really are, a great interviewer. You're curious. You help tell great stories, and you do it in a very consumable way. And I love how open you are about yourself, and we talked a lot about when we recorded your podcast about how I have this thing about I don't like to pontificate, and I like to just share what works for me. And I think you're much the same. And I really love that. And I think that's another reason why we connect so well. So Melissa, thank you so much for having me on your show, for being on my show, for doing this, because I know that, you have a very tight schedule and we spent a lot of time together today. So I've enjoyed every second of it, gotten a lot out of it, and I know that the listeners will as soon as these episodes drop. So thank you so much for everything.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I feel like we're best friends now by the end of all this.
We are besties. So podcast besties, right?